Hello world, this is Craig. Today we're going to do the decoding of the address on the MOD8-5. And remember that mentioned yesterday the MOD8-5 works a little bit differently than the ROM in that each of these chips in the ROM is 1 byte wide. So we address a chip and we look at a line in that and we get the entire byte out. In the RAM board it works a little bit differently. Each of these chips is 1,000 lines long and it's only 1 bit wide. So we have to have 8 of these together. What we do is we put an address into this column and we give that same address to all of them, and so they all pick, for example, their first line, and then each of them contribute 1 bit out to form our byte. So we take these 8 and we have 8 bits, which is our byte, and then we either write or we read to that byte. Now we have got 2 columns, so this is 1K, and then we have another group which is another 1K, so totally this board has 2K on it. And that's exactly the same as we had with the ROM board, where we had picked a 2K block out of our entire 16K memory space. Now we just need to pick another 2K block for our RAM. The first question is, how many bits do we need in order to address just the lines within one chip? So in other words, to decode each chip, how many bits do we need? Well, we can count those up. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512. The 10th address line has a weight of 512 bits. So that means that if A9, which is our 10th address, if that's 0, then all the way down there's 512 lines that we're addressing with that, and then when A9 goes to 1 there's another 512 lines. So that means all totaled, if we use from A0 to A9, we can get a total of 1024 lines, or that's our 1K. And since these are 1K each, we have 1 kilobit there and 1 kilobit there, and all 8 of these together, that gives us 1 kilobyte of memory in that bank. So we have to have from A0 to A9 to select within that bank. That means that we can get by with just 1 more bit because there's 2 banks here. So if A10 is 0, then that can be bank X, and if A10 were 1, that could be bank Y. So all totaled, we need to have addresses up to A10, so from A0 to A10, so 11 addresses to completely decode this board. And then we would just have to select this board just like we did on the 8.4 ROM board. We can compare that. This is where we were with the 8.4 ROM board, where it needed 8 to decode the chip and then 3 to decode which chip. This one needs to have 10 to decode the chip and then 1 to decode which bank. Okay, but in the end, it's the same. We could go up and then have N4, which could be reserved to just select this entire board. Okay, so that makes perfect sense, and it would be perfectly logical, and it would be very, very easy because the schematic would be very close to the way it was on the ROM board. However, it is as if somebody completely different designed the decoding for this board. And it's really quite interesting the way they did it, and it's not interesting in a good way. What they did, if we look at the schematic, so here we've got the 3205, the 74138 decoder, just like we had before, but now they've slid that up. So before the decoder was on 8, 9, and 10, now they have slid the decoder up so that, because we needed to have all the way up to address 9 just for the chip select, they slid the decoder up to 10, 11, and 12. The other thing that's unique about that is this is a 1 of 8 decoder, and we're only selecting 2 banks. We've only got bank X and bank Y to choose from. So we're basically, we're not using 6 of the outputs of this decoder at any one time. But we can see what they're doing is this 1 of 8 decoder selects one output, and then we have our jumpers. That's these jumpers right here. So this is the output of our 1 of 8 decoder. All these pins that I've put in the center row, and then we just pick 2 from the center row to connect to the 2 different banks. And we can, within that center row, we can pick any 2 pins, and that will give us whichever address is associated with that. Just obviously, we can't have the 2 banks connected to 1 pin. But in terms of decoding this, it's hard to go wrong in this because we simply pick any pin to go to bank X and any pin to go to bank Y. So that's pretty trivial. But now let's see what that has done to our board select. Because we switched this entire 3 to 8 decoder up to addresses 10, 11, and 12, that only gives us 1 address left to select the entire board, and that's A13. So what are the ramifications of that? Well, if we look at A13, we only have, A13 is our most significant bit in our address. So that means that if A13 is low, that is half of our address. And if A13 is high, that's the other half of our address. So basically, we've got a 16K address. A13 being low is 8K, and A13 being high is another 8K. So this board is going to reserve some memory space. It's going to reserve 8K at a time. So this single board is going to reserve half of our memory space. Now, that's not as bad as it sounds, although it's maybe not a great technique. We still have a way of avoiding bus contention, even if we have overlapping reservations of memory. The other thing that this did that is a bit annoying is now we've got A13, which is doing our board select, A10, 11, and 12 are doing our bank select, but we're split now between 2 numbers. So before with the ROM board, it was really nice that N3 picked which chip, N4 selected the board. Now it's not nearly that clean. We've got half of this selecting the board and half of this selecting the bank. And then we've got A10 helping to select the bank. So it's just not nearly as clean. The address decoding gets much more confusing, which we will see on the RAM board. Okay, so what do we have for the address decoding? What we've got is when we're using A13 to decode and enable this entire board, we've got addresses that start at 000. This is going to be with A13 equals 0 up to 037, 377. And then if A13 goes to 1, the addresses are going to take up from there at 040, 000, and then go on up to 077, 000. Okay, so this is our 8K block that we're reserving if A13 is 0, and our 8K block that we're reserving if A13 equals 1. So before we actually look at those addresses, let's finish up how the decoding is done. We mentioned that for the bank X and Y, we simply have to put a jumper in to determine X and Y. And now with these little jumpers down here, we determine if A13 is going to be high or if A13 is going to be low. And the way we do that, we've brought out E3 to a jumper, and we have a jumper over here that is connected to logic 1. We've brought out E2, which remember is logic low, to make it active to a jumper. We've brought out A13, and then we've also brought out a logic 0. So what we do is we simply decide, do we want A13 to be high or low when this board is enabled? If we want this board to be enabled when A13 is low, then we will just simply take A13 over to E2. We would jumper these two together. And then E3 has to be high, so we would have to jumper that one together. If we want A13 to be high when this board is enabled, then we would bring the jumper from E3 down to A13. And now E2, to make that enabled, has to be low, so we would take that down to the 0 jumper. Okay, so jumpering is fairly simple. The only thing is that there's obviously tremendous opportunity for error here. Now just some little rules of thumb we can see when we look at this. If you're jumpering this board, make sure that you haven't made any mistakes. First of all, the way they have these laid out, the wires should never cross. If you have A13 either high or low. When they're set up in the jumpers, the wires should never cross because they'll either both go straight across or they'll both go down. But at any rate, the wires won't cross. We do have some unallowed addresses. For example, these are our unallowed addresses. We have E2. Oh, and by the way, E1, they have just taken to ground. So E1 is always enabled, so we don't have to worry about that. But if we have E3 and E2 equal to 1, 0, so if we wired E3 across and E2 down to 0, the board would always be on. So it would always be enabled if we did that. If we did the opposite, which is a 0 and 1, then it would never be enabled. Okay, so we obviously don't want to do either one of those. Just as bad if we did 0 and A13, or if we did A13 and 1, it would never be enabled. So there are some forbidden configurations, but basically they're not much to worry about. It's hard to go wrong on configuring A13 on this particular board. So where it is easy to make a mistake in this thing is in the addressing of the 1 of 8 decoder. Because remember, our 1 of 8 decoder is making 8 1K blocks. Okay, so let's do a truth table that shows where those 1K blocks are. So we're going to do from A13 we're not going to do the lower ones. And remember this A8, 9, and 10, that's what we would normally call N3. These guys are N4, and N5 is, they're just 0, 0 on this. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this truth table. I think I have these address blocks right, and I quit writing all those zeros in there. But basically, this guy's going to go from 0 up to 03377. He's going to start then at the next address up, which is 004, and he'll go up to 007377. Next one up is 010. He'll go up to 013377. 014. He'll go up to 017377. The next up is 020. He'll go up to 023377. After 023 is 024. He'll go up to 027377. 030 up to 033377. 034 up to 03. So these are the 8 1K blocks if A13 is equal to 0. Now let's do the 8 1K blocks if A13 is equal to 1. So now A13 is equal to 1. The nonsense continues because these are our addresses over here, our starting addresses. They're now 040, 044, 050, 54060. They're all oddball addresses just like they were before. Before you go completely nonlinear thinking about this card reserving 8K of memory just for itself, let's go back to the schematic and see why that's not as absolutely as bad as it could have been. When we look at the schematic here, we can see that while the board is technically enabled just by A13, the outputs are not enabled unless a specific 1K block is enabled. Because you look at these two 7400s, 11A and 11B, those look at the actual enable lines going to the two banks of RAM, and it's only when one of those banks that is selected is enabled do the outputs actually become enabled. So what that means is that while this board may reserve 8K, it actually only uses the 1K blocks that are defined by the outputs of this 74138. So that's obviously good news because rather than tying up the entire 8K, it's actually only going to be utilizing the two 1K blocks that are reserved for the two 1K banks. So while it works and technically it's okay, it is asking for trouble because you now can easily overlap this memory, you can actively overlap one of these 1K blocks onto somebody else that already exists. It's just easy to it's easy to make a mistake in this manner, where they could have just decoded it exactly the same way as the ROM. They decided to decode it differently. And If we look in the manual, I think we can get an idea as to what was going on in their mind. They said, the connection shown on the schematic replicates the SIM8 RAM address space. And that's correct. I can't argue with that. It replicates the SIM8 address space, but there were some major differences between this and the SIM8. I think they were trying to make like a poor man's SIM8. And the SIM8, by the way, that was one of Intel's original tools they put out to try to just show people what a microprocessor was. They first made the SIM4, then they made the SIM8, and then equivalent to like the SDK85 was the 8085 version of that. So the SIM8 was an 8008 educational or training or engineering tool to basically, put yourself back into this time period when microprocessors were completely new and they needed these tools. So basically that's what the SIM8 was. But the SIM8 was significantly different in that, first of all, it only had 1K of RAM. The second thing that was different was that the chip it used for the RAM was the 1101, and they were 256 by 1-bit chips. So it was the same thing that it took 8 of them to make a byte, but they were only 256, and the SIM8 used the same 3 to 8 decoder for the ROM and the RAM and on the same addresses, just like we would have thought that they would have done on the MIL mod system, because they needed to be able to decode down to the quarter of a K level with the 256. So basically the 3 to 8 decoder in the SIM was exactly the same as it was used on the Mod 4. The other big thing that was different on the SIM8 was that on the main board where they were doing the decoding, they had made it so that the two 1 of 8 decoders for the ROM and the RAM were mutually exclusive. So they had E3 on one tied to E2 on the other, and so it was impossible for both the RAM and the ROM be enabled at the same time. So their statement is true. On the SIM8, that 1K of RAM that it had was enabled with A11. So that part is true. However, it's almost as if they looked at the SIM8 schematic, they decided to put in the 3 to 8 decoder, then they switched the chip, or they decided to use the 2102 RAM chips, and when they decided to do that, they had to slide the 3 to 8 decoder up by the 2 addresses, and so it's just like maybe it was a comedy of errors and things just going bad, and maybe they were throwing, they didn't want to just invest any more time in it. And I haven't really found anything else with the Mod 8 system that I disagree with, but this RAM board memory decoding is a bit of an exception. I can't say that I really agree at all with the way that they did that, and I think the way that they did do that just made it incredibly confusing and prone to errors. Alrighty, well that's my soapbox, and I can get back off it. I think I'm done on my soapbox, but let me look at, let's finish up with the truth table of the complete decoding and what our addresses would be if we pick any particular configuration on the jumpers. Okay, so I got these all written out. This is our 4 addresses that are involved, a 10, 11, 12, and 13. Depending on that address we put in, this of course is our board select. This is our bank select. So whichever of these bank selects we use for our X and our Y, these would be their range of addresses. So for example, from all zeros to 377, this one up here is 040 to 043 377, 044, up to 047 377, and so forth. So you can figure these out. You can look at these. Maybe we can talk Charles into putting this into the manual, the full table, so that we don't have to figure these out each time. All right, well, that is all I've got to say. That's enough for the Mod 5 or 8-5 RAM card. And the next one I'm excited to do is the Mod 8-9B, which is the new multi-memory card, the RAM, the ROM, and the other EEPROM, 2716. All right, well, that's what I got for this time. If you have any questions or any comments, leave me a note below, and I appreciate you watching. Hope you got something from it. Thank you. Bye-bye.